Good afternoon and welcome to all. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Katie Coldiron and I'm the digital archivist at the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab of Florida International University in Miami, Florida. Oral history interviewing is a unique art, and one could say that it takes years of work to truly master. However, one should not be discouraged from taking it on, as it is important in terms of memory and community preservation, particularly in an ephemeral area like South Florida, where we have historically grappled with displacement of communities due to climate and economic concerns. In this vein, we at the WPHL have spent the last 2 years working on the Mellon-funded project, Community Data Curation, preserving, creating, and narrating everyday stories, alongside 8 community partner organizations in Miami-Dade and Broward counties. These partner organizations include the St. La Haitian Neighborhood Center, the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, the Museum of Graffiti, Historic Hampton House Museum and Cultural Center, Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, the African American Research Library and Cultural Center, Broward County Library, Stonewall National Museum Archives and Library, and the World AIDS Museum and Educational Center. We have organized a semi-interactive workshop primarily in support of our community partners in this project, but we are nonetheless very happy to have participants here from all over Florida and beyond. By semi-interactive, we mean we've decided for each speaker to present for approximately 15 minutes, with 5 minutes in between each one for questions and commentary from the audience. Without further ado, we will begin with our first speaker, Jane Field, and I will give you Jane's professional bio. Jane is the Community Archives Director at Texas After Violence Project in Austin, Texas. At TAVP, her work includes managing the After Violence Archive and running the Oral History Interview Program. Her interests include community memory, narrative storytelling, and anti-oppression memory work, documenting legacies of violence in the American South. Jane is a co-founder of Mourning Our Losses and a member of the steering committee of the Community Archives Collaborative. She has presented at the Society of American Archivists, Oral History Association, Texas Conference on Digital Libraries, Texas Inmates Family Association, and regularly leads workshops on conducting trauma oral histories and multimedia storytelling. She has a BA in Literature from Bard College and an MSIS Information Studies from the School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. So without further ado, please welcome Jane Field.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Katie. So I do not have slides today, but I am going to put a resource list in the chat when we get to the questions that y'all can check out for more information about trauma interviewing. And I don't know if everyone had an opportunity to watch the video on trauma that Katie shared. It's a great but brief overview of trauma and features one researcher who's really led the field of trauma studies for the past couple of decades, Bessel van der Kolk. And so I do recommend it. But basically, just to give a brief overview, very, very brief because we don't have much time. A couple of important things to note about trauma and how people experience it are, one, it is much more common than we often consider it. Trauma is not just something that happens to, veterans of brutal wars, people who have experienced violent attacks. It occurs in people's everyday lives in any number of ways, and basically can occur whenever someone experiences a great deal of fear or an expectation that they might die, and that can happen. That can happen in a number of scenarios, and everything from food insecurity to a car accident, where your life might not actually be at risk, but you think your life is at risk. All of those can lead someone to experience symptoms of trauma or develop PTSD. And another thing to note is that for people who are exposed to stories of trauma indirectly, so they might not have experienced the event themselves, but they are listening to someone retell a traumatic experience, that can cause trauma as well. It is one of the factors that can lead someone to develop PTSD, just as any other traumatic experience that someone might experience firsthand. So I want to note that, because when you're conducting interviews with someone who is experiencing trauma, you are yourself becoming at risk for developing symptoms of trauma as well. And I also want to note that there's a difference between a traumatic experience and then developing something like PTSD, where you suddenly start having symptoms of trauma where your memory is impacted, your sleep might be impacted, you might be triggered by certain factors in your environment that you don't know why they're triggering you, but you're suddenly back in the physical space of that traumatic experience. Not everyone who has a traumatic experience develops these psychological symptoms of trauma. So that's important to note too, that the symptoms, the physical experience of trauma is separate from the event that led to that traumatic experience, that came from that traumatic experience. And again, I apologize for the brevity of that explanation, but go back and watch the video or some of the resources that are listed that I'll be sharing with you to learn more about trauma and how it impacts people. So all of that being said, one of the main goals of when you're interviewing someone who has experienced trauma and who might be dealing with ongoing impacts of that traumatic experience, is to give them back some level of control, because they experienced a lack of control and that's having an ongoing impact on their life. So that really starts with how you set up the interview in advance and conduct a pre-interview with the person that you're planning to interview. And it's really important that at every stage of the process, you go really slowly, because you are putting people at risk of re-traumatization just by nature of conducting an interview with them. And you can't always predict who's going to experience re-traumatization. And so the only way to mitigate that is to go really slowly, and then you have time to sort of see it coming in the distance, and you can pull back, you can check in with the person constantly leading up to the interview, during the interview, after the interview. So again, if something happens and they need to step back, you can make that step before, harm is done. And oftentimes people are aware that they're putting themselves at risk of re-traumatization by participating in an interview, but they want to participate anyway because of, to share their story, to help someone else who might be going through a similar experience. So the potential for re-traumatization isn't necessarily a reason not to do the interview, but it is a reason to be very clear at every point, be transparent, and be really active in your communication with the person that you're interviewing in order to anticipate moments where harm might be bubbling up. So when you're getting ready to do an interview and you are doing your pre-interview prep and pre-interview communication with the person that you're speaking with, again, you want to be really transparent. You want to go over all of the logistics, probably multiple times, to make sure that they know exactly what to expect from the interview. You want to go over the questions that you'll be asking them. You want to give them an opportunity to tell you areas that they aren't comfortable talking about, that they don't want to go into during the space of the interview. You want to go over the consent protocols, some people call it the contract, the consent form, a donation form, whatever your project is using to sort of facilitate consent and come to an agreement with the person that you're interviewing. You want to go over that really carefully and check in with them, inform them of potential risks, inform them of the potential risks of re-traumatization, not in a way that is meant to scare them, but just to have a clear and honest conversation about what they can expect, and how y'all will work through those potential pitfalls together, so that you're together working on coming up with a plan to do the interview as safely as possible. And again, in all of this, transparency is just the biggest key, just making sure that you are being really open with them, and listening closely to them and their needs, letting them know everything that is going to happen, again, because they've been put in a position in the past where they had no control, no ability to anticipate the future. And so it becomes really important for them to be able to have that security of knowing exactly what to expect. And it becomes your job to make sure that you're following through or communicating changes as they come up. And another thing in the pre-interview process, and really at every stage of the interview, it's important to be willing to step back at any point. So you can spend hours on the phone with someone, and then when it comes time to meet them with a recorder, and set up the interview, they might say, you know what, today's not the day, or I decided I'm not ready to do this interview at all. And it's really important to respect that, to step back. And your interview is not as important as their mental health and well-being. And be sure to honor that, and respect that at every step. So during the interview, again, you really want to accommodate the interviewee. This includes setting up the space so that they're comfortable, allowing them to change up the space if you're meeting physically. So they might want to rearrange the furniture so that they feel more safe. They might want to sit in the chair that faces the door. So just giving them the option to really create the space that they feel most comfortable in is important. And if you don't have much control over the space itself, at the very least, you want to have found someplace quiet, someplace safe, someplace you won't be interrupted. And so even if it's not the most comfortable space, pointing out those factors, and really describing the space and saying, why you've chosen it for these factors that make it safe is also really important. If you are doing an interview virtually, it's important for you to give them context about the setting that you're in. So right now, I'm speaking to you all from my home. There's no one else here except my dog and my cat. So you can have an expectation that anything that's said in this space, no one else but me is going to hear. There might be people in your space that you want to think about, but in my space, it's me, it's quiet. So again, giving them context about your surroundings is equally important, so that they know that what they're sharing with you is confidential. And again, there might be someone else in your space as well, but you can say, I'm by myself, but I'm wearing headphones, so no one can hear what you're saying, all of those little details. When you're asking questions, it's important to be open-ended, to allow the person being interviewed to meander and tell the story as they want to see fit. When someone's experienced trauma, that can impact the way their memory works and forms. It really challenges linear memory. So someone might be sharing a story and they might jump back and forth in time. They might go on a tangent that doesn't necessarily make sense initially, but it's important to just let that space continue, let them follow the path that they want to take, because that's how they're remembering an event. And that is, one impact of trauma. That's not them lying. That's not them trying to, confuse you, or it's just the nature of the interview. It's just the nature of someone who has experienced something traumatic. And again, I think that's one of the really great opportunities that oral history interviewing offers, because you ideally have the time and the space to really let someone take as much time as they need to tell their story. And you can sort out all of the little factors of, did this happen first or second? You can sort out those timeline issues after the fact. And then if you want to redirect, you can do so, but just be really gentle about it and try not to challenge them. If you get confused, that doesn't mean that they're lying, or that they're trying to misdirect you. That's just the way they're sharing their story. So be very gentle in the way that you redirect people. And if you want more tips on that, there are some interview webinars that we have on our website, on the resource list, that I will share with you. And then also just take breaks and check in constantly. So consent doesn't stop when someone signs a consent form. You want to constantly, not constantly during the interview, but regularly, you want to check in and make sure that they're okay to continue. They might, you definitely want to take a break. We try to take a break about once every hour. And that's a great opportunity to sort of check in and see if a person feels comfortable continuing, or if they need to stop for the day. And again, that's completely fine. I've had interviews stop, before we necessarily thought they would, just because the person was done. And that was fine. So I'm just going to quickly go over a few things I know we're out of time, but quickly, a couple of things for after the interview. You should always take time to sort of ground yourself and the interviewee after you are leaving the space of the interview. So this can be as easy as asking them what they're going to have for dinner that night, just something to pull them into the present and out of the space of their memories that they're recounting of their traumatic experience. You want to, again, go over expectations and next steps, be really transparent. You want to follow up with them, and you want to follow through with what you said. So find a time to check in with them, see how they're doing. We do most of our interviews in Texas. We have a resource list that has, mental health support in every county in Texas. So if we follow up with someone and they're struggling, we can recommend services for them. And then also and this will feed into Kelly's talk, but you want to really take your time with post-interview consent, going over the interview after it's been created, and make sure that they have an opportunity to consent again before an interview is made public, that they're comfortable with all of the pieces shared. It can be really an intensely emotional experience to share an interview. So they might say something that they later decide they don't want to share, and providing that opportunity to go back and edit an interview, restrict some of it, is really important. And again, after the interview, they may decide that they don't want it to be made public. And at that point, it doesn't matter how many hours you've invested in that interview, you have to respect their needs and goals. So we have a whole collection of interviews that may never be made public because the person who was interviewed decided that they weren't ready at that time to make their interview public. And it's a bummer because they're great interviews, but I would never want to make something public that could hurt someone to have it out in the world. So that is my brief intro, and I apologize for going so quickly. And hopefully, if you're intrigued by anything, you can learn more and dig in deeper.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. That was incredible. For those of you that don't know Jane, along with Gabriel Solis out at the Texas After Violence Project, they're really pioneers in this type of work and in the community archive space. So I really do encourage you to check them out. I'm putting the resource list just because I had it up, Jane. This is the one you're talking about, I believe. Please explore it, as well as the rest of their website. Their interview collection is incredible. And I was introduced to the community archives through them back when I was a student out at UT doing a capstone project. So we have a brief amount of time, approximately 5 minutes, where we can field some questions and comments from the audience. So if you could just please use the raise your hand function and unmute yourself, and we will go from there. I see we have one question already from Beatrice.
Yes. Hi, thank you, Jane, for that presentation. I found it very interesting. I'm working with a community group right now, and your presentation coincides with some of the concerns that they have about being able to retract components of the interview after it's even been posted. So I was wondering if you have language from the oral history release form that could address those concerns, and if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
Yeah, I can, Katie, if I email a copy of our consent form after this, you'd be welcome to share it. We say the language is basically, and this is something that we go over in conversation multiple times with people before the interview. So it's not just a line in the consent form, but something that we reiterate. If someone wants their interview to be taken down after it's published, we will respect that. We'll take it down. If there's a piece that they want edited out, we'll edit it out after the fact. However, once something has been posted online, you lose control over it to a degree. So
right, because even if you were to decide to take it down yourself as an institution, you don't have control of what's happened to it in the meantime.
Exactly. Someone may have downloaded a copy, illegally. Someone may have copied the transcripts. We have interviews that someone has, and this is fine, they cite us, they're allowed to do it, but they've taken the entire transcript and they've copied it and posted it on their blog. So we just try to be really, really clear at about what we can and cannot offer, that we'll do everything in our power to respect their wishes and take it down after the fact or make an edit after the fact, but we can't guarantee that someone hasn't downloaded a copy of it as it originally was. Okay. So I think you do the best that you can, and you just be really transparent about the the limits of possibility.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Do we have anybody else? Ramona, Dr. Ray, go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to just thank Jane for mentioning the fact that when you're listening to the stories, you too can be affected. I used to work with teenagers who had been abused, and I remember reading a book, some people that had did some videotapes of these children, and they got sick. The videographers got sick from listening to the stories. And I myself, after working at this psychiatric hospital for young people, after 6 months, I had to leave. I mean, my body physically was, not good, not in good shape. And I remember my supervisor saying, don't worry, one day you'll be numb, you won't feel it. And I said, oh no, I never want to be numb, I have to leave. And so I resigned. But so thank you so much for underscoring that, because I think it's very important. We don't think about, the stuff we take into our psyche on so many different levels, whether it's interviews or television, we can be affected by what we, put in our psyche. So thank you.
Do we have anybody else? We have about a minute left. So feel free to raise your hand. If not, we'll go on to the next speaker. Erica, go ahead, please.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to ask more about when the speaker spoke to being careful not to re-traumatize your interviewee. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe how to handle that or what specifically to avoid?
It's hard to give a across the board response to what to avoid, because what could re-traumatize someone, it's different. It would be different for everyone, and it could depend on what sort of trauma they experienced. And that's why you just need to really go slowly and have open communication with the person that you're interviewing, so that if they start to get agitated, if they start, if they started to have a panic attack, that would be one thing you would see, like, oh, this is causing harm. It's time to step back. Hopefully you don't get to that point, because you're going slow enough that if it starts to become too much, they can pull back. I think forcing someone to talk about a traumatic experience when they are not, if that's not what they want to do. Ideally, they're at a point in their journey where they're able to talk about the experience of trauma. If you're there to interview them about something traumatic that happened to them, you're not going to be interviewing someone who hasn't already done healing work to a degree. And again, there are therapeutic methods for helping someone heal from trauma, and retelling stories of that trauma is really important, but this is not that space. It can be healing for people to tell or to share an oral history interview, but it can equally be harmful for others. So you shouldn't go in with the expectation that it's going to be healing for them to share their story. So if it's causing harm, if they're not comfortable, you just have to slow down and check in with them and see how they're doing. And someone can be crying while they're sharing their story, and that's not a bad thing. Emotion is good. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're re-traumatized, but it might, if they're getting really emotional or shutting down, dissociating, where they sort of zone out or staring off in the distance and not really engaging with you, then these are times when you can check in and see how they're doing and if they want to stop. And you can always say, I think you can always offer to come back. So you can say, it seems like there's a lot more that we want to talk about, but I'm, thinking about time, and it might be a good time to pause for the day. And then we can always come back and do a second round interview another day. And then when they have that break from the interview, they might realize, like, oh, I was sort of getting to a bad place. I don't want to finish the interview, when during the space of the interview, they might have wanted to just barrel through and keep talking for 3 more hours. I don't know if that helps.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. For the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Kelly Rowan. Kelly Rowan is the Digital Archives Librarian in the Digital Collections Center at FIU Libraries. She serves as the ETD librarian, publishing all university theses and dissertations. She also works closely with both internal FIU partners and external community partners, like in our Melanie project, to create and host digital collections in dpanther, FIU's digital repository. Currently, Kelly is leading an equitable and reparative metadata initiative within the libraries and is researching, publishing, and developing workshops on privacy data and the science of survey development for the Digital Scholar Studio at FIU. Her research interests include privacy, AI, equitable metadata practices, social science, and surveys. Finally, she is an active member and chair of multiple national, regional, state, and local library affiliates and presents regularly at conferences. She holds master's degrees in music, religious studies, and library science. And without further ado, take it away, Kelly.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do some screen sharing here. So let's see. All right, you can see my slides, right? There we go. All right, you can see the slides, correct?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure. So I'm going to talk about the privacy end of things here. I'm actually going to put on my timer, make sure that I keep myself within the allotted amount of time. You'll see me moving my little window around because it gets in my way all the time. So I love that Jane talked a little bit about pre-interview when dealing with, people dealing with trauma. And so some of the pre-interview, you are going to reach out to people. You're definitely going to reach out to them. Some of it you can do on your own at home and try to figure out what exactly you need to be careful about. So if you know what kind of trauma you're dealing with, one of the things I would say to look out for, which is going to require perhaps more privacy awareness, is going to be any trauma resulting from crime, from criminal acts, right? There may be ongoing court cases. People may be at risk of like retribution or like an ongoing court case, which may affect whether or not you can post this oral history in the end, things like this. So that you want to know that before you go in. And then I like the question here on the left which is what are the consequences? And it's what are the consequences if privacy is lost, right? So in the instance perhaps that your narrator says, yes, I would be happy to do this oral interview, but we can't release it. We can't disseminate it for 2 more years. I'm in the middle of a legal battle, whatever. But it gets out there before then. What are the consequences of that? And I have a little case study that I'm going to share with you of kind of like everything gone wrong so that you can see this happens. So, if the consequences, I didn't want my family to know, they make fun of me for talking about this all the time. We still don't want to bring that on somebody, but it's not dire. No one's going to die. No one's going to prison because of something we have done, right? So you want to know what is the risk factor, and who is at risk here. So our narrator, right, the person you're interviewing, what if they talk about friends and family and other relatives? That's something you need to be aware of as well. Did they give consent to be talked about? What information they reveal about these people too? They may talk about trauma that came from a workplace, like an organization, and now you have to worry about things like defamation lawsuits that may come back for the person already experiencing trauma, may come for them, may come for you, or your university. So when thinking through this, you are protecting yourself, the narrator, and assuming you're working for a university or whatever institution, a museum, or whatever you're working for. And the other question you want to ask is, who do you need to protect the information from, right? If it's your toddler getting a hold of your laptop, that's not a huge risk, and you don't have to take a lot of security, measures in order to protect it. If you potentially think governments and enforcement agencies, thinking of people who've been traumatized, maybe from immigration status, citizenship status, I strongly believe there's a point where you walk away and say, we can't do this, right? Because you actually can't protect this kind of information from enforcement agencies and governments. So these are questions you want to ask in that pre-interview stage before you go in. All right. So let's talk about what PII is, or sensitive information, and what is personal information that you need to watch out for when doing this. So sensitive information is information that absolutely 100% identifies you. Like you can give an agency your social security number and everything comes up, like credit, your name, your address, your age, your birthday, everything, right? So it's absolute identification, right? Personal information, it usually takes about 3 things to absolutely identify you. So if you have my birth date and you also have my address and place of employment, you can piece together that the Kelly you were hoping to stalk is the right Kelly you've got, right? Because FIU has a Kelly who lives at this address, and my address, the Kelly that lives at this address, works at FIU. Like you can be sure that's me now, So you do need to still be careful, even with just personal information in that sense. So I'm going to talk about sensitive information that you may not have thought of as sensitive. This isn't as much, this list isn't as much about, absolute identification as it is sensitive information that carries with it the risk of some type of retribution, right? And that can come from race, ethnicity, citizenship status, criminal records, religious beliefs, all sorts of stuff. We've seen this, even in our own department where students publish a thesis, but they come from a country where
please text the address here.
This could get them killed, if it were found. So, you want to be careful with maybe stuff you didn't think about as being falling into that sensitive information category too. So, if you're sitting down with somebody and you start out with the usual, we're interviewing so-and-so on this date at their home in Coral Gables, and then they end up talking about their 23andMe test, and they mention the union they belong to and religious beliefs. I always like to say, think of your oral history if it were a spreadsheet and you had to fill it out as a spreadsheet, right? So in that first column, you've got name, city they live in, and then you start going through that information, you find out you have their first job, the city, the year it was in, who their boss was, you have what religion they are, and so when you think of it, like, what would it look like as a spreadsheet? You suddenly realize much more clearly how much personal information and sensitive information you actually hold in an oral history.
Welcome, beloved. Are you on the yacht this evening?
All right. Personal information. So things we mentioned, birth date, address, phone number. Think of things like photograph. Jane mentioned, like, you go to someone's house, you're interviewing, they may want to move around. Are there photographs of their family and friends behind them? Are they cool with that? Voice can be identified. So maybe someone said, yes, I'll do it, but I'm going to use an alias, no video, audio only. Remember, you can identify people by voice too. So these are all things to think of as we try to protect people that may be in vulnerable situations. Moving on. All right. So in all of my privacy workshops, what I tell everybody is just live your life, your data life, by the GDPR. Okay. If you do this, you will be fine. The GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU. It is the strongest privacy act in the world. And many countries that are not part of the EU have developed similar privacy policies modeled upon this one, and like Australia and other countries. And so if you just follow this in taking care of your data, you should be fine. There are like the state of California has modeled their privacy laws after this. So if you find yourself interviewing someone from California, someone who's a citizen of a country like Australia that's not EU but has a very similar policy, or an EU citizen or somebody with dual citizenship, realize that they are protected by really strong laws that you can quickly run afoul of by not taking care of these. So these are the basic principles over here on the right of the GDPR. Lawful and fair. It's an ethical guideline of how to handle data. And it's really how we all should be doing it anyway. That's why I just tell people, just follow the GDPR. Jane mentioned clearly spelling things out, right? So the GDPR Privacy Act is about being fair, right? That means not the US version where we put it in 4-point font buried in 3 pages of 4-point font paragraphs. That's not fair and that's not transparent. So the GDPR isn't about how to get around the rules. It's actually about being fair and transparent. And so we want to do that with especially with people dealing with trauma, right? Minimize the data you're collecting. So your narrator may want to talk about their religious history and their 23andMe genetic information. And that's fine. And maybe you can talk about that and explain risk and edit it out later if they really want to talk about it. If, you know, after you explain risks or before you explain risks, maybe they don't want to talk about, but talking about those risks is really important. You want your data to be accurate, kept for the least possible amount of time. So if you think oral histories are likely going into archives, archives keep things forever, what can we do? Well, narrators should have control if they need to pull it at some point. They suddenly feel uncomfortable, they should be able to say, now this needs to come down. It also means this is also about you, the interviewer, too, right? So you don't want to hang on, you don't want to go home, right? And upload that to 20 different sites. You've got your oral history all over the place. I mean, you do want to back it up, you know, so there's that safety part of not losing your data, but it needs to be done securely. And then when you have it where it's going and a preservation copy safely somewhere, be sure you've deleted all this from your systems and anything else you have, right? All processing of data and data flows must be secure, confidential, and done with integrity. So this means if you go home and you're like, okay, I'm going to work on this oral history and do some editing and stuff. Well, if your teenagers are in the background, what happens tomorrow at high school? And they're like, oh man, you should have heard this like interview my mom was working on last night. And the person was talking about blah, 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 right? You have run afoul of the GDPR. So you need to think about this in processing and working with it. If you're working at a museum, or a university, you need to think about who else can access this. Did I just upload this to the network drive? Right? So these are things you want to think about as you deal with this kind of information, especially trauma victims who maybe have put restrictions on it, like this can't go out right now, this can only go out after my death, this whatever can't go out till the end of a court case, or I need to think about this longer. So we need to be extra cautious. So we already talked a little about the dissemination and the consent forms, right? So clearly spelling this out, going over, you know, all of these risks and what are their expectations, who will have access, will it be IP restricted? Will you only be able to see this if you come on campus? Is it out there for the whole world? I would also add to what people said about transcripts before. A lot of them, just the way they are hosted, the way to view them is to download them. And then you really have zero control. So that's something to just consider if your narrator is uncomfortable with, you know, full dissemination without, let's say, IP restrictions or something. So in your consent or release form, the narrator, and I love that Jane talked about this, we can give them some control back. And that's sort of a healing mechanism, right? Because the core of trauma is the lack of control, one of the core elements of trauma. So, you know, we can say you have final say on the content. You can change your mind and say, I don't want this to go up. Or you can change your mind in 2 years and say, I need to take this down now. So you want to be able to negotiate this and be flexible and understand that they may change their mind several times, right? I understand institutions are sometimes like, nope, they need to sign this form and it's ours, end of their rights. I would say if that is the policy of your institution, then I would just avoid oral histories. Personally, I just wouldn't do them. I certainly wouldn't do them with trauma victims, right? And then, of course, you want to think about preservation, where are those copies, who has access? And that's going to be important. All right, so I just want to come back to the GDPR for a moment. So if you're like, nah, I don't need paying attention to GDPR, I'm good. Well, let's keep in mind that for less severe fines, like if you compromise this type of data, the starting fine is 18.4 million. I can assure you that if FIU gets hit with an $18.4 million fine, that your employment is in question. So be careful. And if you're thinking, yeah, but who really fills out a complaint form? Oh, no. In Europe, this is very easy. This is like something you can do in 30 seconds on your phone. They don't make it an onerous task like we would here if, to go through government files and report a complaint. No. So they go through over 60 fine. These are things that just end up with a fine. So they're getting more complaints that they're also looking through. Just last year, over 1 billion in fines were levied. Amazon alone, 877 million, but 18.4 is the starting point for fines. If you happen to be interviewing a dual citizenship person, and again, remember, California has fairly strong privacy laws that mimic a lot of this, not up to 18.4 million, but also very strong privacy laws. So you don't want to run afoul of it either. So be careful. All right. Ooh, right at 15 minutes. I'm just going to summarize this really quick. So this is a wonderful case study. If you study oral histories, you already know about this one because it happened in 2014, but Boston College did a project on the IRA in Northern Ireland. 2 people, Hughes and Price, gave interviews and they said, okay, but these, so if you're not, this is Miami. So if you're not familiar with Northern Ireland and the conflict, this is about murder, basically, right? So lots of traumatized people. Hughes and Price gave interviews and said, hey, but you can't release this till after our deaths. One of them died. The archivists were careful, right? They didn't even release all the tapes even then. They just released parts because in there, the Sinn Féin party leader, Gerry Adams, was implicated in the murder of a mother of 10. And so, but what happened is the Belfast police said, oh, wait, you have interviews? We're coming for those. And they won. It took them 2 years, but they won. But during that time of that legal battle, Dolores Price, the other narrator, died of what most assume was a self-inflicted drug overdose. And in the end, Gerry Adams and Ivor Bell, another person, were arrested. So at the end of all this, Boston College had to give up the oral histories. 2 people were arrested and 1 person may have killed themselves. So this just goes to show you, if you're dealing with risky information and you're like, oh, this happened ages ago and this is from Ireland, a foreign country, they can still get it. And this shows it right here, right? And nothing would have stopped them, right? Just the fact that the tapes existed, even if they didn't publish any part of them, if they had ever found out that the interviews happened, they would have come for them. So I just like to caution people, ask yourself, if you're dealing with something that has a criminal element, ask if it's worth it. What role do we play in justice? Because I don't want to be the person who gets somebody killed. I'm not supporting Sinn Féin. Let me make that clear. But I'm just saying, still, I don't want to be this is not my job. I'm not an attorney. I'm not law enforcement. I don't want to be in that position. And I don't think any of us do. So, and that is my presentation. So we can discuss.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. I think I speak for everyone when I say I learned a lot. So let's keep it the next few minutes for questions and comments, so we can start with Juan's presentation by 1:55. I know he's informed me that his is at about 10 minutes, so I think we can get out by about 2:10. So if we have any questions or comments for Kelly, please use the raise hand function. Andy.
Hey, real quick question, idea of not just for Kelly, but also maybe perhaps for the group. I'm wondering, does anybody have a frequently asked questions sheet that might be a good thing to use on the front end with people to kind of make them aware of some of the issues that you described? I think, I don't want to open a huge can of worms by doing that, but it just seems to me that there's implications of this that a lot of people wouldn't think about down the line. And where I am at the World AIDS Museum, where I'm having people talk about things that are extremely traumatizing and stigmatizing, I'm just curious, does anybody have a resource like that they give to people?
Jane or Kelly?
I don't actually generally, interview or make oral history. So I think that would be more in the purview of those doing the oral history work. So no, I don't have anything like that, but I am imagining that there are some LibGuides from universities that cover this. I know Duke does have one with 6 questions. I think there were 5 core questions and they added one of their own. And I can find that link for you and drop it in the chat. That might help. I will find, just give me a few minutes, but I'll find it.
I'll just share. Jane dropped a note in the chat that says that at TAVP they have an oral history information sheet that goes over some concerns that they provide for people to use as they decide whether or not to participate. I'm guessing that's on the resources site. Thanks, Jane. And then just like what she talked about follow-up and ongoing consent, I think really speaks to that. In terms of, I will say with the grant, we are creating all kinds of really great documentation associated with this grant. And I'm constantly adding things to the ideas to have a kind of all-encompassing manual when this is over. So, doing things like this always gives me ideas. So that's definitely something we can incorporate into that. And I will pass along like a shared drive link with the resources that have been mentioned here. So let's go to our final speaker, Juan David Rojas. Juan David Rojas is a case manager for Church World Services Post-Release Services Program here in Miami, Florida, for unaccompanied migrant youth. Juan holds a BA in Political Science and an MA in Latin American Studies, both from the University of Florida. For his master's thesis, he conducted research on the ongoing migratory crisis in the Western Hemisphere by interviewing those that had traveled or were planning on traveling through the Darien Gap region between Colombia and Panama. He has also conducted research on police-community relations in Medellin, Colombia, where he facilitated hundreds of meetings between police officers and city residents. His research interests include security and politics in Latin America. Without further ado, Juan, are you ready to go?
Hello, everyone. And I just wanted to thank Kelly really quick for that very interesting case study with Jerry Adams and Sinn Féin. I did not know about that. All right. Let's see. I'm sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, there are from Big Guy. Okay. And on that note, so for my presentation, what I thought I'd do is that based on the foundation that Kelly and Jane have given us, I'd run everyone through on what conducting interviews with people who've experienced trauma plays out in practice. So I'm a case manager. I work for Church World Service, which is a faith-based global humanitarian organization. Was founded in 1946 after the Second World War. Provides disaster relief, sustainable self-help, a lot of different things. But one of those is working with refugees and immigrants, especially here in the US. CWS has assisted over 865,000 refugees and immigrants to start new lives in the US and to integrate in those communities. And so specifically, what I do is that I work with kids who enter the country without accompaniment, what are called UCs, unaccompanied children, that may have been traveling with other minors, but not necessarily their parents or alone. And as you can see in this graph, this is an ongoing phenomenon. Last year, almost 80,000 unaccompanied children were released to sponsors that came into the country. So a sponsor is known as someone that we refer to as sponsor. It's someone who wishes to sponsor, provide guardianship over a child who has entered the country. Usually it might be the minor's parents or a parent or a related family member or a family friend, but sometimes the sponsor might be completely unrelated to the child. And as you can imagine, Florida, I'm based in Miami. is one of the top states that receives unaccompanied children, the others being Texas, California, New York. But I have cases, for example, or one case right now in Alabama, and it's a phenomenon that happens all over the country. And so I'm not going to go through this entire flow chart because it's a bit complicated, but it's just to give an idea of how the process works. So if you're under the age of 18 and you enter the US, you'll be apprehended and spend, sometimes it can be up to 3 months in a shelter. In a shelter, they will, they'll provide you with vaccines and go through a lot of records to try to get together your identity and see if you have family members in the US that might be interested in sponsoring you or otherwise, and also psychiatrically assess the children for medical or mental health conditions as well. And so at CWS, what we do is we provide what's called post-release services. So after a child is released from the shelter to a sponsor, the shelter will verify the sponsor's identity, as well as the minor. Organizations like CWS, there are other organizations that do this too. We essentially provide case management for the child and caregiver to make sure that they have resources in their communities. Whether it's legal, we provide them resources to pro bono lawyers, low-cost medical centers, and we make sure once we're assigned a case, we're expected to visit our clients, and during a visit, we will we'll greet the minor and sponsor, explain what we do, ask them if they're interested in services. They can't obviously reject them, but we essentially see that the minor has everything they need in terms of a roof over their head, food, running water, a bed, and is in a safe situation. So during a usual visit, we'll talk to both the minor and the sponsor at the same time, and then conduct individual interviews where we'll ask them, we have to make sure that the minor and sponsor aren't liable for any sort of payment relating to the child's journey. The child feels safe, is comfortable with who they're staying with, etc. And so I'm not going to go through all this. Jane did a really good job, but our job is to look out for signs of abuse. As you could probably imagine, a lot of these kids really have gone through a lot, depending on the country that they've come from. Some from as close as Central America, others from farther away have gone through in these horrible journeys, being separated from their parents. Oftentimes when they get here, they want to work, and if they're underage, that's a problem because they need to be in school. And they a lot of times will want to work to support their families, and can be difficult. Yeah, language barriers, academic challenges, etc. And so with the kids that we work with, there are signs, obviously, of trauma that you can identify. As Jane and Kelly said, confidentiality is extremely important. When we conduct a visit, we have the child and their guardian sign a welcome letter and a release form, and we inform them that everything that they tell us is confidential. But obviously, if we see or are told something that puts the life of the child in danger, we do have to report that to the authorities, and that sometimes occurs. So for when speaking for myself, when you're conducting an interview, you always just want to listen carefully and openly, be truthful, honest, aware of your limitations, and aware of the limitations of the person that you're interviewing. Secondhand trauma is a concern that case managers sometimes have. But when you're talking to someone, you want to acknowledge if you don't understand or don't know how to react to something that they might have told you. And yeah, you want to take it slow, as Jane said. Don't push your interviewee. You want to make sure that what they're telling you is something that they want to tell you, and they will tell you what they want to tell you. Particularly as they come to trust you. We have months-long relationships with our clients, and during that time, a child or a sponsor will develop more trust in a case manager, and they'll tell us things that they might not have told us before. And it can be complicated sometimes. We have some information on our clients that they don't necessarily know that we know. But so just as Jane said, you want to ask these open-ended questions because our primary duty is to make sure that the child is safe and we can provide them with the resources that they need. So for example, if they experience something extremely traumatic in their home country or during their journey, we try to provide them with mental health services, counseling, etc. But ascertaining whether that's desirable can be a little difficult. An example I wanted to give was I knew beforehand that a minor that I went to go visit based on documentation that I had prior, he reported in the shelter that he had used drugs, but I didn't necessarily know if his mother, the sponsor, knew that. And so I had to talk to him, ask him first open-ended, have you ever used drugs before? He told me yes. And I asked him, does your mother know about this? He said no. I asked, is it okay if we tell her this? It's probably helpful. She would probably want to know. And I think that that's important, and he agreed to it. So then we told the mother, and it was actually surprisingly non-conflictive. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. We're gonna open it up for the next few minutes for questions, comments from the audience, not just for Juan's, but for everybody's, since we're here at the end. So if you have a question you've been holding on to during the presentation, we want to give you the space to be able to ask it or make a comment. Just use the raise hand function. We have one, Dr. Ray.
Hi, thank you, Juan. I noticed you mentioned, or you didn't mention it, but in the notes it said gender, depending on gender. Can you speak to that a little more?
Of course. The majority of kids that we work with are boys. Something like 70 to 80% of UCs of unaccompanied children are male, but there are special needs that we often have to see to depending on a child's gender. And unfortunately with girls, they can frequently be victims of sexual crimes.
Okay. Okay. So does it make a difference when you're doing an interview, the gender of the interviewer?
You mean like the case manager in my case?
Yes.
It certainly can. At my office, the other case managers are all female, and yeah, in my experience dealing with my clients, the rapport that I have sometimes with male adolescents can be a little bit difficult, or a little bit different. I try to ask them about their interests and find things that I might know that'll help them. Similarly with girls, but something I'm more familiar with, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else? We have a hand. Erica.
I had a question for the second speaker. I am a graduate student who is starting up an oral history project all by myself. So I don't really have access to, very many like security tools and things. I'm kind of just using Google Drive. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about protecting privacy, what steps should I be taking to make sure the information I have is secure?
That's a huge question. Do we have another hour, Katie? I have presentations already up in a repository that list some good things to think about. If you want to just send me an email, Erica, I think it might be easier. I can kind of write a few things down in the email and give you links to some of the resources I have, of where to keep it, what are the risks associated with how you keep it. So in Google Drive, you might have seen when I had the slide up, Google's been fined numerous times. Google Ireland has been fined. Google here in America has been fined multiple times. So it means the security, according to the EU, they're not meeting GDPR guidelines, right, for keeping data secure. But I have some other options. There's like a ton of different ways to, quickly. I can throw one out that I use. I use Proton Mail. It's fully encrypted, and they offer also a fully encrypted drive, and it's free. You can do this for free. And you can even implement their VPN for free. So you might look at Proton Mail. So if you get a Proton Mail account, you'll get their free drive, and that is fully encrypted, and it is one that the GDPR recommends. So that might be a starting place, but I can give you lots more resources if you want to, and I can drop my email in the chat again so you don't have to search for it.
I will definitely do that. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to let you all know once again that I will be, whatever the speakers choose to share with me, consent forms, their presentations, there will be an email coming out to all of you with all of that in one place. So be on the lookout for that. Do we have anybody else in this last few minutes? Speak now or forever hold your peace. I don't see anybody. So I guess we'll just go ahead and wrap up here. We're at 2:12. We did this more or less on time. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. Most importantly, I want to thank our speakers, our panelists, for these really great presentations. The recording of this event will be on YouTube as well as in FIU Digital Commons and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Labs collection on there. And yeah, have a great rest of your afternoon.